Hey everyone, this is Chapter 9 of Peter Drucker's Max Shachtman and His Left. Chapter 9 is titled, The quote, American Century, end quote. Looking back from later decades, people of the most varied outlooks have seen the early and mid-1960s in the United States as a golden age of prosperity and progress. By comparison with the 1980s and 1990s, the country's trade balance in the mid-1960s was favorable, economic growth rates were high, unemployment was low, and economic gaps between rich and poor, black and white, seemed to be narrowing. Liberals can look back nostalgically to New Frontier and Great Society rhetoric about eliminating poverty and racism. Conservatives can point to the prosperity that followed Kennedy's tax cuts as evidence for supply-side economics. But mid-1960s leftists of all stripes had a view of their society that was far removed from this retrospective glowing vision. Socialists as well as many liberals saw that the progress of the unions and the civil rights movement in the 1950s was running up against a dead end in the 1960s. They saw the future of working and poor people, white, black, or brown, depended on the economy's ability to create thousands of new jobs at good wages. They saw that African Americans' hard-won equal rights to be hired for any job and live in any neighborhood would be largely empty if there were no new jobs they could be hired for, and they could not afford to live in good neighborhoods. And they saw the economy's creation of new jobs was slowing, a trend that the artificial Vietnam War boom of the late 1960s would only temporarily conceal before 1970s, quote, stagflation, end quote, made it obvious. In the early 1960s, the urge to find a solution to the problem of jobs and economic growth pulled Max Shachtman and his followers into the Democratic Party. In the late 1960s, the attempt to find a solution through the Democratic Party would first divide them from many of their African American allies, then pit them against one another. Shachtman and Michael Harrington became the main spokespeople for two different groups of socialists with two different approaches, two different theoretical perspectives, two different social constituencies, allegiances to two hostile wings of the Democratic Party, and two contrasting attitudes about Marxism's relevance in late capitalist society. In his own way, Shachtman continued to put the working class at the center of his approach. From the 1920s until the mid-1940s, Shachtman had defined the working class as insurgent rank-and-file workers who would push aside the pro-capitalist union bureaucracy, form their own political party, and install a workers' government as steps towards socialist revolution. In the late 1940s, Shachtman had turned toward the Reuther wing of the CIO, counting on it to form a labor-based national liberal party whose left wing could turn it into an instrument of peaceful, legal, democratic socialist transformation. After the 1955 AFL-CIO merger, Shachtman came to see the central AFL-CIO leadership as a force for progressive change and the Democratic Party as the crucible of a future labor-based liberal party. By 1964, Shachtman decided that the Democratic Party was virtually a labor-based liberal party already. Shachtman decided that Lyndon Johnson's administration was a force for civil rights and in social reform and deserved strong support. At the 1964 Democratic Convention, he allied with the administration to settle the Mississippi Freedom Democrats' challenge to segregationist Mississippi Democrats through, quote, compromise, end quote. He moved from trying to drive moderate machine and white Southern Democrats out of the party to helping to keep them in. Harrington, by working on Johnson's anti-poverty programs, helped connect Shachtman to the summit of the U.S. political system. Shachtman began by arguing for involvement in democratic politics as a means to advance African American interests, but he soon subordinated African American demands to holding the Democratic Party together and ensuring the AFL-CIO's predominance within it. His strategy for African American equality diverged from that of many African Americans. Shachtman opposed black power, broke with its spokespeople such as Stokely Carmichael, and drifted away from Martin Luther King Jr. He worked instead with African Americans who found niches for themselves in labor's network, particularly Bayard Rustin, who became director of the new union-funded A. Philip Randolph Institute, and A. Philip Randolph himself. The, quote, freedom budget, end quote, issued by the Randolph Institute in 1966 and baptized by Shachtman, outlined his and his allies' strategy for social change. It said that poverty in the United States could be abolished in 1975 without undue interference with capitalist, quote, responsible free enterprise, end quote, simply by keeping the economy growing fast, keeping unemployment rates under 3%, raising the minimum wage, and having a guaranteed annual income for those few people who could not find or take jobs. It implicitly assumed that all these desirable outcomes could be brought about by keeping Democrats in the White House and Congress and keeping them in line behind a reinvigorated New Deal coalition led by the AFL-CIO. Having committed himself to keeping together the coalition that had elected Johnson in 1964, Shachtman found that he could not keep it united around either a leadership or a program. Since Shachtman saw the AFL-CIO apparatus as the incarnation of the U.S. working class, Shachtman believed that the AFL-CIO had to lead the Democratic coalition. Others refused to accept the AFL-CIO's dictates. Since he saw labor as the key agency of social change, Shachtman believed that full employment and unionized jobs was the key to the, quote, Great Society, end quote. Others believed that automation was pushing the unions to the economy's sidelines. Mike Harrington became the leader of ex-Shachtmanite socialists who refused to concede the dominant role in the Democratic coalition to the AFL-CIO. Mike Harrington looked instead for compromises between Harrington looked instead for compromises between labor leaders and representatives of, quote, new politics, end quote, a loose network of progressives mostly inside the Democratic Party who were trying to capitalize on the black, Latino, feminist, youth, countercultural, and anti-war ferment of the 1960s. Harrington drifted away from Shachtman's version of Marxist orthodoxy toward the more free-thinking socialism of Irving Howe's magazine, Dissent. These differences might never have turned into deep antagonistic divisions if not for two circumstances. First, the differences among socialists were enmeshed in divisions in the Democratic Party. The realignment strategy which Shachtman had imagined would allow socialists to work together effectively inside the Democratic Party turned it out to be a formula for forcing them to choose between rival Democratic politicians fighting for primary votes in inter-party offices. Second, the differences happened to arise as a popular movement exploded against the Vietnam War. The U.S. war in Vietnam, which escalated in 1965 after Johnson's re-election, was the dynamite that blew apart the disparate elements of Shachtman's coalition. He chose the year of Johnson's decision to escalate the war to come down firmly, as his 1951 statement on Korea and his 1961 statement on Cuba had foreshadowed, the U.S. power as a lesser evil than communism in the Third World. At first, most socialists went along with, or at least tolerated, his stand. For his part, after announcing it at a June 1965 forum, he kept quiet about his support for the war and helped work out a series of compromise positions in the Socialist Party. The call for, quote, negotiations now, end quote, was the fig leaf that allowed socialists to cover their growing divisions. But in 1970, Shachtman and his allies reaffirmed their continued opposition to U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam in a public statement, which resulted in a public bitter break with Harrington, Howe, and others. As Shachtman became an apologist for U.S. global power, Walter Reuther turned against the war, rebelling against George Meany. Stokely Carmichael and Martin Luther King turned against the war and away from Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph, and Democratic Senators Eugene McCarthy and George McGovern turned against the war, challenging Vice President Hubert Humphrey and Senator Henry Jackson for control of the Democratic Party. The Socialist Party, which had tried to work with almost all these different forces, finally split over the McGovern campaign in 1972 to 73. 20 years later, none of its splinters has realized the promise that Shachtman saw in the Socialist Party in 1958. Shachtman had always aimed to build U.S. socialism into a strong movement rooted in forces like the labor and African American movements, ones that would have the power to turn society upside down. Once he abandoned his left-wing socialist ghetto in the late 1950s and early 1960s for the mainstream of social democracy, Shachtman may well have imagined that he had found his way to a broader, more relevant, less fractious political home. But in the United States of the late 1960s and early 1970s, social democracy proved to be impossible to hold together in a single organization with a single tradition. Shachtman's brand of Marxism helped divide the Socialist Party deeply and kept it from benefiting significantly from either his patient networking or the biggest radical upsurge in the United States in 30 years. By the time Shachtman died in late 1972, Shachtman had helped define a distinctive organizational and ideological strand in U.S. social democracy, one that is almost unique in the world. On international issues, the Middle East and Central America, as well as Vietnam, latter-day Shachtmanites have consistently been on the right wing of international social democracy, but they have combined their right-wing international perspective with a profession of Marxist orthodoxy that is unusual among social democrats, founded on a strong identification with the working class. In the last months of his life, Shachtman tried to reaffirm his Marxist identity in various ways, some sentimental, some practical. Shachtman reached out to Jim Cannon, his old communist and Trotskyist mentor, visited him in California, and declared his undying loyalty to the ideals and hopes that he and Cannon had shared. At the same time, out of similar emotional impulses, Shachtman reached out to people who in the old days had been his and Cannon's most bitter antagonists on the left, the remnants of the pre-1936 Socialist Old Guard. Before he died, he helped unify these old-time, hardline Social Democrats with what was left of the Socialist Party. In turning towards these unabashed Social Democrats, Shachtman turned his back on his own political history as a communist, Trotskyist, and independent socialist. Yet paradoxically, at the same time, he reaffirmed his identity as a New York Jewish Marxist from immigrant working-class roots. Shachtman's death followed 4 years after the 1968 Tet Offensive against the United States and Vietnam, an event that some have seen as the beginning of the end of the, quote, American century, end quote, that Henry Luce declared in 1945. For most of his political life, Shachtman had worked to bring this American century to an end, supporting movements that resisted the power of U.S. capital in Europe, Asia, Latin America, and inside the United States. Yet as the American century headed towards its end, Shachtman aligned himself with forces working to prolong it in Vietnam, in the AFL-CIO, and in the Democratic Party. After a lifetime of resistance, Shachtman made his peace with the American century. The 1964 election pulled Shachtman and his socialist allies completely into the Democratic Party. The Democratic candidate, Lyndon Johnson, seemed to put forward the core of their agenda: civil rights, full employment, and end to poverty, peace. The Republican, Barry Goldwater, who anticipated both Richard Nixon's, quote, Southern strategy, end quote, aimed at disgruntled white Democrats, and Ronald Reagan's unabashed conservatism, incarnated the Dixiecrat Republican evil. Shachtman's followers turned the Socialist Party into a virtual Johnson campaign committee. When Johnson won the 1964 election by a landslide, Shachtman found himself for the first time on the same side with two-thirds of the U.S. electorate. Michael Harrington said, quote, if the Democratic left rises to the occasion, then the Johnson landslide could provide the basis for a major period of social change, end quote. Michael Harrington. Working almost entirely behind the scenes, where his too radical past would embarrass no one, Shachtman thought that he could have an impact on the administration's policies. Through Harrington, who worked for a while on Johnson's Great Society anti-poverty programs, Shachtman could even imagine that he had the ear of the president. Even though Shachtman seemed to have found his way to the corridors of power, Shachtman had not become an advocate of the status quo. Shachtman still argued for drastic changes in U.S. society, an argument that in the mid-1960s united Shachtman not only with other socialists but with many liberals. Many progressives in the mid-1960s thought that the status quo was not only unjust but in trouble. A spurt in military spending after 1965 concealed the economy's difficulties by artificially prolonging the boom and keeping unemployment down. But in fact, a quarter-century of high profits for U.S. capital ended in 1966 to 67. In a long period of declining profits, trade deficits, and deindustrialization began. Danger signs were visible to some even in the early 1960s. Economist Leon Kaiserling, and AFL-CIO President George Meany warned the League for Industrial Democracy's annual conference in 1961 that unemployment rates were tending to rise in each successive business cycle. Nearly all the new jobs were in either the public or service sector. Many industrial jobs were dependent on Defense Department contracts, which were threatened, before 1965, by Defense Secretary Robert McNamara's military spending cuts. The benefits of growth were distributed inequitably. The poorest 20% of the population received 4.9% of the national income in 1944, but only 4.7% in 1963. Shachtman's speech after the 1963 March on Washington connected the future of the civil rights movement to the problematic future of the economy. Shachtman focused on the problem of job creation. What the civil rights movement had won so far was, quote, trivial, end quote, in comparison with what still needed to be won, Shachtman said. The crucial tasks remained: improving African Americans', quote, abominably low, end quote, living standards, education, health, and housing. The way to achieve these goals, Shachtman stressed, was to get African Americans good jobs at good wages. There would be no good jobs at good wages, however, as long as the economy was not working efficiently, quote, even to the extent that our dubious prosperity under American capitalism allows it to work, end quote, and as long as mass unemployment persisted, even in the midst of an economic boom. Once Shachtman would have concluded that since mass unemployment was endemic to capitalism, most African Americans would not have good jobs at good wages while capitalism lasted. But now Shachtman looked to solve the problem of mass unemployment under capitalism through the political clout of the AFL-CIO. Shachtman's confidence in AFL-CIO leaders had grown and his followers became more influential in AFL-CIO councils. By now it was almost boundless. In the early 1960s, starting from their basis in the United Auto Workers, Shachtman's followers had begun getting jobs in the national AFL-CIO. Sammy Fishman became president of the Michigan AFL-CIO. Don Slayman led the way into the AFL-CIO headquarters in Washington by becoming head of the AFL-CIO Civil Rights Department. Through Slayman, Shachtman got the ear of Lane Kirkland, AFL-CIO President Meany's assistant and eventual successor. Shachtman began taking fewer cues from Reuther and more from Meany. United Federation of Teachers President Albert Shanker hired Shachtman's wife, Yetta Barsh, as his secretary, providing another connection to a national AFL-CIO leader. Shachtman extended his AFL-CIO network by helping his young followers get union staff jobs. In 1965, following the 1964 collapse of the Young People's Socialist League, Shachtman reconstituted under his right-wing followers' control. The new group had barely a shadow of the independent spirit of Shachtman's earlier youth groups. Even Tom Kahn, who had joined Shachtman's youth group in a livelier time, regretted that the group had few vigorous debates. But debates were no longer the group's main point. Its main point was to take young people whom the 1960s had begun to radicalize, immunize them against the New Left's subversive appeal, and train them for AFL-CIO or other social democratic careers. The suspicion of the old AFL and its leaders that Shachtman had grown up with, suspicion that had reinforced his hostility to the La Follette campaign in 1924, to the socialists working for Sacco and Vanzetti, and to the socialist old guard that supported Roosevelt after 1936, fell away in the early 1960s. It gave way to an enthusiasm for top AFL-CIO leaders that was sometimes qualified with critical reservations on paper, but unconditional in practice. In a letter to Harrington in 1963, Shachtman wrote, quote, "While my admiration and respect for these trade union social democratic movements in the most important countries of the world are under very strict control, I cannot ignore the fact that after 3 or 4 decades they have proved to be entirely immune from Stalinism on the one hand, and from the often predicted dissolution into purely bourgeois reform movements on the other side, ... There is something durable and tenacious in these movements, ... A social force of tremendous proportions and power." End quote. Shachtman. Shachtman's newfound respect for union officialdom made Shachtman look differently at his own past and his old adversaries, particularly old-time social democrats like Morris Hillquit. Shachtman had never had a kind word for Hillquit before Hillquit died in 1933, or for many years afterward. Morris Hillquit had been a die-hard anti-communist, the man who expelled the left wing in 1919, the pillar of the Socialist Party's old guard. By 1963, Shachtman praised Morris Hillquit for trying, quote, to bridge the gap, between the socialist movement and the labor movement, end quote, that socialists had opened by opposing the First World War. The irony of the road Shachtman had taken was brought home when, in January 1971, Shachtman was chosen to give a prize named after Hillquit to Charles Zimmerman, an official of the International Ladies' Garment Workers Union who had once been a communist and supporter of J. Lovestone. Charles Zimmerman jokingly boasted that his, quote, greatest contribution to, the Socialist Party, end bracket, was that I helped expel Max Shachtman from the Communist Party, end quote. In 1928, Shachtman filled his 1971 award speech with praise for Hillquit and calls for new ties between socialist and AFL-CIO leaders. Quote, what is in the forefront of our minds and hopes, is to restore these old ties, to make them stronger, to make them invincible, in the common struggle for social justice. For us socialists today, as for Morris Hillquit in his time, the working class and the working class's natural movement, the unions, are the social force and mainspring from which we draw our inspiration, even now, end bracket, when every trifler and dilettante finds it fashionable to sneer at it, end quote. Shachtman said that Hillquit's heirs had been right in 1936 to support Franklin Roosevelt, and socialists like Shachtman who opposed Roosevelt had been wrong. The New Deal coalition, quote, worked, end quote, Shachtman said. Quote, it did not produce socialism, but then that wasn't Roosevelt's intention, end quote. Shachtman predicted that the New Deal coalition would be, quote, a decisive element in American politics for a long time to come, end quote. Strengthening the New Deal coalition and making the AFL-CIO's role within it predominant and hegemonic was Shachtman's answer to the challenges facing progressive movements in the 1960s. Shachtman's speech after the 1963 March on Washington was to a large extent a sermon on the importance of a labor civil rights alliance and the union's key role. Given the fact that Maney had not even endorsed the march, though Reuther had, he had to put much of the blame for the Labor Civil Rights Alliance's fragility on labor, quote, is a wretched labor movement, end quote, he said, quote, miserable on civil rights, end quote. But wretched or not, the labor movement was the force that Shachtman said could win political power. Implicit in his reasoning was the transitional goal he had advocated since 1949 to 51, a government that, without installing socialism, would be dominated by labor, push through social reforms, and adopt a democratic foreign policy. Only a labor-led government could create full employment in the capitalist United States through a public works program and massive social spending. Without these policies, Shachtman said, quote, the unions are crippled, end quote. With them, the civil rights movement, too, could achieve its goals. Therefore, labor was the civil rights movement's one indispensable ally. Civil rights activists had to push for unity, even bend over backwards to achieve unity with the AFL-CIO. Bayard Rustin, with his ties to Martin Luther King Jr.'s Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Congress of Racial Equality, became Shachtman's point person for the Labor Civil Rights Alliance. The alliance took on institutional form with the A. Philip Randolph Institute, which promoted civil rights in the unions and linked the two movements together. Rustin directed the Randolph Institute under Randolph's titular authority. The AFL-CIO provided the funding and ultimately set the political parameters, a role reminiscent of white liberal donors' role in the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, as Shachtman had described it in the 1930s, The Randolph Institute produced the 1966 Freedom Budget, a labor civil rights agenda for changing national priorities worked out by Bayard Rustin, Randolph, and economist Leon Kieserling. Shachtman thought up the name. The Freedom Budget was in fact the most detailed program for domestic social change worked out from Shachtman's final social democratic perspective. The Freedom Budget was remarkable for its insistence that, quote, poverty in America can and therefore must be abolished within 10 years, end quote, parenthesis, by 1975, end parenthesis, while leaving the capitalist economy intact. It accepted, quote, our traditional concepts of a, quote, mixed economy based upon responsible free government and responsible free enterprise, end quote, implicitly assuming that pro-labor democratic administrations would be in office throughout the 10 years. It mistakenly foresaw unemployment rates below 3% and growth rates of 4.5 to 5%, at least until 1975. All the social programs for which it proposed to abolish poverty were to be funded with only a fraction of the resulting, quote, economic growth dividend, end quote. The Freedom Budget, in fact, proposed to abolish poverty simply by raising annual federal social spending from $39.5 billion in 1965 to $67.5 billion in 1975, parenthesis, in constant dollars, end parenthesis. Its wish list of specific programs and policies consisted mostly of demands that the AFL-CIO had backed for years: national income insurance, repeal of Taft-Hartley, authorized, quote, right to work, end quote, laws, a higher minimum wage, parenthesis, $2 an hour, end parenthesis, higher Social Security and welfare benefits. Its most radical-seeming demand was a guaranteed annual income, a program whose cost to the federal government would have been manageable if unemployment had in fact stayed below 3%. The private sector would then have provided the guaranteed income to 97% of the workforce and their families. Though the Freedom Budget relied on an interventionist government to organize economic growth and redistribute the resulting wealth, it expected the private sector to provide the great bulk of the money. If the Freedom Budget was Shachtman's economic prescription for the civil rights movement's troubles, it presupposed a political strategy that could keep the Democrats in office and keep Democratic administrations committed to full employment. Shachtman's political strategy was a New Deal coalition dominated by the AFL-CIO. The strategy led him to confrontation with some of the African American leaders he had been close to earlier in the 1960s. It began stirring doubts among some of his own socialist followers, such as Mike Harrington. Lyndon Johnson's 1964 re-election campaign was a turning point. It persuaded Shachtman that splitting the Democratic Party was not the best way to defeat the Dixiecrats and Republicans. He argued instead that a Democratic Party, including most of its current constituencies, though under a consistently progressive leadership, could be the vehicle for social change. Socialists should not try to split the Democratic Party, he said now, but instead turn it into the party the left needed. Quote, if we don't have enough strength to take over the Democratic Party, end quote, he said, quote, how are we going to create a Labor Party with any prospects for winning, end quote. Until the left could take over the Democratic Party, he decided that the left had to preserve the Democratic Party. This conclusion led Shachtman and his friends to try to rein in people on the left who were too confrontational and divisive. At the same time, however, some civil rights leaders who had been close to Shachtman were concluding that they had not been confrontational enough. Stokely Carmichael and other leaders of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Congress of Racial Equality were beginning to stress the importance of African Americans organizing and freeing themselves instead of trying to bargain with the white power structure. Shachtman's new attitude toward the Democratic Party and the underlying thrust of his approach to African American issues since the 1930s went counter to these first stirrings of black power. Shachtman's African American allies close to the AFL-CIO, particularly Rustin and Randolph, also distrusted the new militancy. Rustin said that black power was both, quote, utopian, end quote, because, quote, 1/10 of the population cannot accomplish much by itself, end quote, and, quote, reactionary, end quote, because it took African Americans out of the Democratic Party, quote, the main arena of political struggle, end quote. The Freedom Budget stressed that in order to unite working and poor people behind reforms, quote, the war against want must be colorblind, end quote. The gap between advocates of a labor civil rights alliance and advocates of black power widened until in December 1966, Rustin and Carmichael were debating their opposing strategies in public. A turning point came with the fight among the Mississippi Democrats at the 1964 Democratic Convention. 68 pro-civil rights freedom Democrats led by Fannie Lou Hamer challenged the right of 68 white Dixiecrat delegates elected by a process that excluded African Americans to represent Mississippi at the convention. The challenge seemed to be exactly what Shachtman had called for at the 1963 March on Washington, but Shachtman and his associates no longer favored such uncompromising tactics. They now feared division among Democrats because they wanted Johnson to win. Together with a phalanx of civil rights, labor, and liberal leaders, they exerted a, quote, moderating influence, end quote, to induce Freedom Democrats to accept an administration-backed, quote, compromise, end quote, that seated all 68 Jim Crow delegates and seated 2 token Freedom Democrats as at-large delegates. Rustin urged the Freedom Democrats to go along gracefully, saying, quote, if you are going to engage in politics, then you must give up protest, end quote. Parenthesis, later he went back to apologize to them, end parenthesis. After Walter Reuther threatened Martin Luther King with a cutoff of the considerable United Auto Workers funding for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, King came and told the Freedom Democrats, quote, the Democratic Party is the best we have, end quote. After Reuther threatened the Freedom Democrats Council, Joseph Rao, with losing his retainer as United Auto Workers Council, Rao urged his clients to give in. Herbert Humphrey, rumored to have been told that the vice presidential nomination could hinge on his usefulness in this awkward situation, appealed to Hammer with tears in his eyes. Hammer, I'm not sure. Hamer. Michael Harrington later said, parenthesis, citing Democratic Representative Al Loewenstein, and parenthesis, that Hammer was willing enough to accept the compromise, but the historical record tells a different story. At one meeting after another, the Freedom Democrats indignantly refused to take the advice that was pushed on them from all sides, and Hammer set the tone, quote, we didn't come all this way for no 2 seats, end quote. Many African-American activists shared her sense of outrage and betrayal. Carmichael and Charles V. Hamilton's 1967 book, Black Power, called the incident proof of liberals', quote, bankruptcy, end quote, and proof that effective coalitions could be built only after African-Americans had built, quote, an independent base of political power outside the Democratic Party, end quote. James Forman told the 1967 New Politics Conference that black activists had been, quote, victims in the liberal labor circle's lies, end quote. For their part, Shachtman's followers saw the compromise as a, quote, dividing line between an older, more primitive idea of realignment and a more sophisticated one, end quote. The division between the African American movement and Shachtman's AFL-CIO allies reached its bitterest during the 1968 New York teachers' strike against community control of New York schools. Whatever Shachtman's role in the conflict, his ties through his wife to United Federation of Teachers President Albert Shanker identified Shachtman with the striking teachers. Charges of racism against the mostly Jewish teachers and of anti-Semitism against the mostly African-American community activists flew freely. The strike left a legacy of bitterness and suspicion between white union leaders and the African-American community for decades afterwards. Shachtman's deepening commitment to an AFL-CIO Democratic Party network also contributed to the final break in 1965 between Students for a Democratic Society and its parent group, the League for Industrial Democracy. Shachtman's followers rose steadily to prominence in the League under Nathaniel Minkoff's titular presidency. In 1964, Shachtman's young follower, Tom Kahn, became its executive secretary, and Harrington became chair of its board. It promoted Harrington's The Other America and issued influential pamphlets by Kahn, parenthesis, quote, The Economics of Inequality, end quote, end parenthesis, and Rustin, parenthesis, quote, From Protest to Politics, end quote, end parenthesis. At least one right-wing Republican saw the Socialists in the League as a sinister, quote, idea factory, end quote, with a, quote, demonstrated effectiveness in molding public opinion, end quote, and close ties to the AFL-CIO's political machine. But the young radicals of Students for a Democratic Society consider the League's social democratic agenda far to their right. At their 1965 national conference in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, delegates sang a song about the League they were breaking with. Quote, "Along came the LID as fast as it could run. Going down that SP rode just 40 years behind. Nathaniel Minkoff at the wheel a-trying to make lost time, receiving very strict orders from the Shachtman just behind." End quote. In 1964 and 1965, despite growing tensions around black power and the New Left, the great majority of socialists seemed to go along with Shachtman's support for AFL-CIO leaders, the Johnson administration, and a united Democratic Party. But in fact, socialists were beginning to head in different directions. Subtle differences in approach were beginning to sort them into two camps, one led by Shachtman and the other by Mike Harrington. One root of the differences was Harrington's critical attitude toward Shachtman's Marxist orthodoxy, which went far back in Harrington's history. Harrington had joined the Socialist Party rather than Shachtman's Independent Socialist League in 1952, even though the Independent Socialist newspaper, Labor Action, had won him to socialism. The Independent Socialist League was Marxist, and Harrington believed that as a Catholic he could not be a Marxist. After he left the Socialist Party and helped found the Young Socialist League in 1954, Harrington gave up his Catholicism, decided that he was a Marxist after all, and became a member of Shachtman's group in everything but name. But Harrington's unorthodoxy showed itself again in the 1960s as he distanced himself from Shachtman's understanding of working-class politics. Harrington worked in the early 1960s with liberal and leftist intellectuals who said that the U.S. economy's difficulties in generating jobs were not due simply to capitalism or the labor movement's lack of power, but to the technological revolution brought about by automation. For many of them, automation meant that industrial workers were less important now as force for social change, and technicians and intellectuals were more important. One 1964 statement called, quote, "the Triple Revolution," end quote, was signed by dozens of intellectuals, including Harrington, including such statements as, quote, "wealth produced by machines rather than by men is still wealth," end quote, which had little in common with Marxism as Shachtman had always expounded it. Harrington soon drew explicit political conclusions from his theoretical unorthodoxy. A nervous breakdown in 1965, which Harrington later attributed to unease with his newfound prosperity and influence as a popular author and Democratic Party intellectual, gave Harrington time away from Shachtman to do his own thinking. The social ferment of the 1960s began to have an impact on him. Harrington had been as uncomfortable as Shachtman with the emergent New Left politics as black power leaders like Carmichael or student radicals like Tom Hayden. But with new forms of dissent and resistance springing up in different parts of U.S. society, a movement against nuclear testing, a new youth culture, the beginnings of the second wave of feminism, he began looking for ways to converge with them. Shachtman, let me repeat what I'm saying. Harrington had been uncomfortable as Shachtman with the emergent uncomfortable as Shachtman with the emergent new left politics of black power leaders like Carmichael or student radicals like Tom Hayden, but with new forms of dissent and resistance springing up in different parts of U.S. society, a movement against nuclear testing, a new youth culture, the beginnings of the second wave of feminism, Harrington began looking for ways to converge with them. Harrington looked toward the, quote, new politics, end quote, growing up on the New Left's moderate fringe, mainly inside the Democratic Party at first. Quote, the theory of the working class, quote, the theory of the working class, end quote, historical mission had been undermined by the technological revolution, end quote. Harrington said in January 1966, quote, no single class but a coalition of progressive forces is now necessary to achieve a radical transformation of society, end quote. Harrington began looking for some kind of merger between new politics and the, quote, mass new left wing of American society, end quote, represented by George Meany. A radically insurgent working-class politics could have converged in many ways with the new African-American, Latino, feminist, and cultural radicalism of the 1960s, even if the most prominent spokespeople for these new radicalisms were middle class. Their broad constituencies were to some extent working class. In fact, they were largely the new working class sectors that the AFL-CIO was failing to reach. White-collar and service workers, the labor force's fastest growing and least organized sectors, were disproportionately people of color, female, and young. A new rank-and-file insurgency in the 1960s, even among blue-collar workers, such as the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement, tried to link labor activism with African-American and New Left militancy. But rank-and-file union insurgencies were relatively rare in the 1960s, and there were few chances for labor and new social movements to connect. New politics, sometimes completely counterposed to labor, was the most prominent alternative among Democrats and socialists to an uncritical orientation towards AFL-CIO officials. It's kind of confusing. It keeps saying new politics, but that's not in reference to the magazine or the journal. Shachtman argued that any genuinely progressive movement would win or lose depending on whether the union movement advanced or retreated. Other movements' demands had to fit into a labor-based strategy. Shachtman and his co-thinkers had no interest in diluting their avowedly working-class politics with middle-class liberalism. Quote, in our political, quote, coalition, end quote, a group of intellectuals and a union of a million members, a department of college professors, and a Negro organization of 500,000 are not equal in numbers, influence, political experience, tenacity, discipline, in a word, in social weight and durable political power, and they cannot be, end quote. Rustin, he said, quote, we assign more importance to the labor movement than to any other force in the coalition, end quote. Shachtman's and Harrington's different approaches surfaced in the League for Industrial Democracy. As Harrington took office as chair of the League's board in 1964, he proposed that the League should have a, quote, unique triple constituency of intellectuals, trade unionists, and civil rights activists, end quote. Kahn's speeches as the League's executive secretary laid less stress on the intellectuals, to whom the League had always had ties, and more on the trade unionists he saw as key. But the League reinforced its ties with leftist intellectuals nonetheless in 1966 by establishing a special working relationship with the socialist magazine Dissent. They planned to hold joint forums and publish joint pamphlets. The arrangement helped bring Dissent editor Irving Howe closer to Harrington. Harrington's relationship with Howe, like his unorthodox attitude to Marxism, dated back to the 1950s. In Dissent's first years, out of bitterness at Howe's, Stanley Plastrick's, and Manny Geltman's desertion, Shachtman had the Independent Socialist League prohibit its members from writing for or supporting the new magazine. Harrington, however, proudly and defiantly had the Young Socialist League officially encourage its members to write for and support Dissent. At a time when Shachtman's New International was eking out its life, putting forward the organizational line of a small and isolated organization, Young Socialists were bound to find Dissent's more ecumenical and free-thinking approach stimulating. Though its editors were to Shachtman's right, they published independent cultural thinkers such as C. Wright Mills, Paul Goodman, Herbert Marcuse, and Norman Mailer. Michael Harrington confirmed his support for Dissent by becoming a contributing editor in the fall of 1957. For a time in the late 1950s and early 1960s, Shachtman, Harrington, and Howe all seemed to work together more closely. Shachtman commented in 1957 that the, quote, icy coldness of the dissenters, end quote, had thawed somewhat. Howe and Shachtman worked together on an anthology of Trotsky's writings and actually met again in 1961. Howe said, quote, it was pleasant to meet you again after all these years, Max, end quote. And Shachtman answered, quote, I had the same feeling, end quote. But tensions remain. Howe refused to join the Socialist Party, irritating Shachtman with his willingness to speak for socialists without ever affiliating with them. When Shachtman's Bureaucratic Revolution, the anthology of his writings on Stalinism over 2 decades, was published in 1961, Howe reviewed it briefly and not very warmly. Shachtman's one contribution to Dissent, a review published in 1964, was a somewhat tired restatement of his views on the Soviet Union. By late 1966, Harrington was willing to align himself openly with Dissent's intellectual tradition in its pages. in words that could be read as distancing him from Shachtman's tradition. Harrington recalled mockingly his suspicion of dissent in the late 1950s when Harrington said that he thought its editors were, quote, hell-bent for liberalism, a fate worse than death, end quote. In hindsight, Harrington praised dissent for its decision to, quote, strike out in search of new relevance, end quote, instead of continuing to, quote, incant old truths, end quote. Only an insider could have detected any criticism of Shachtman in Harrington's words. To all public appearances, the two men were still close, two leaders of a small socialist movement. They still seemed to agree on basic questions. Both supported liberal Democrats, labor and civil rights, and a democratic foreign policy, and both were disenchanted with black power and the campus radicalism of Students for a Democratic Society, but the tensions between them were there, waiting to be triggered. The war in Vietnam pulled the trigger. The last decisive test for Shachtman's worldview came with the U.S. war in Vietnam, which reached its full scale in 1965 and continued on its bloody course until after his death. Shachtman extended his devotion to trade unions and union-backed reform movements to the very different context of South Vietnam. Such hopes as he had for Vietnam he pinned on South Vietnam's small anti-communist opposition, its powerless independent unions and Buddhist dissidents and peace activists aligned with them. Seeing that a communist victory threatened the anti-communist opposition as well as the U.S.-backed series of South Vietnamese military dictatorships, he decided that U.S. troops should stay in South Vietnam to defend South Vietnamese Democrats. For the first time in Shachtman's life, he openly supported a U.S. war, ironically picking one of the most unpopular wars the United States ever fought. Shachtman and his followers had always looked for an anti-Stalinist left to support in conflicts between capitalism and communism. As early as 1954, the independent socialists committed themselves to finding a third force in Vietnam, insisting on neutrality between communists and the Saigon government, even though, quote, French imperialism and its armies are the aggressors, end quote. Shachtman stuck to this perspective even after many of his followers gave it up as hopeless. But his position on the Vietnam War after 1965 contained two major departures from his earlier stands on the Korean War and the Bay of Pigs invasion. First, during the Korean War, Shachtman had dismissed any idea of coexistence or peace between capitalism and Stalinism. Shachtman saw the two systems' warfare and his inevitable and overthrow of both as the only way out. By 1965, Shachtman's closer acquaintance with Vietnamese trade unionists linked to the AFL-CIO made him see Vietnam differently. Shachtman saw the only hope for a Vietnamese third force in a negotiated settlement. Second, Shachtman had never before supported a U.S. military presence anywhere in the world. Shachtman never repudiated independent socialist 1950 call for a unilateral U.S. withdrawal from Korea. At the time of the Bay of Pigs invasion, Shachtman took refuge in the fact that the invaders were technically not U.S. troops. As late as August 1961, Shachtman had called publicly for withdrawal of all U.S. forces in Vietnam. But by 1965, Shachtman decided that U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam anytime soon would doom any negotiated settlement, would ensure a communist victory, and had to be opposed. Shachtman resolved to defend the South Vietnamese anti-communist left, even if he had to rely on the U.S. government and its South Vietnamese client regime to do it. The anti-communist left was never able to stand on its own in Vietnam because, as in Yugoslavia and China, communists had become the major force fighting for national independence during the Second World War, showing that they could not be defeated or manipulated by the Japanese, French, Americans, Soviets, or Chinese. By defeating the French at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, communists made their position as Vietnam's national leadership unassailable. When a national resistance movement grew up in South Vietnam in the early 1960s and was organized into a national liberation front, communists were in firm control. The United States provided the finances for the French colonial war in the early 1950s and troops, money, and strategy for the war in South Vietnam in the 1960s and 1970s. U.S. military, quote, advisors, end quote, limited to 685 under the 1954 Geneva Agreement, rose to 16,000 by 1963, 200,000 in 1965, and 500,000 in 1969. With the number of U.S. troops increasing, the number of U.S. deaths also inevitably rose, and with them the number and anger of protesters. The war in Vietnam, whose brutality further shook people already shocked by white violence against the civil rights movement, helped fuel a new radical upsurge. But the New Left's roots in the labor movement were as feeble as the Old Left's had been strong. Most union officials supported the war, and anti-communism was pervasive even in unions that opposed the war. The AFL-CIO had Vietnamese trade unionist contacts, some of whom Shachtman met. The South Vietnamese government harassed and jailed these unionists, but they nonetheless felt even more threatened by the prospect of communist victory than by the status quo. Shachtman was impressed by the fact that the AFL-CIO had enough concern and clout with the administration to get South Vietnamese unionists out of jail on occasion. Apparently, it did not occur to him that unionists whose freedom depended on the U.S. government's whim might be poor representatives and fighters for their members' interests. Mike Harrington remembered one discussion that took place in 1966 in a community room in Bayard Rustin's apartment building. Quote, "Of course, the war is horrible. The killing should be stopped as soon as possible," end quote. Harrington remembered Shachtman saying, quote, "Of course the United States is involved with dictators, scoundrels, and knaves," end quote. But Shachtman insisted that democratic socialists should try to stop the killing and oppose the dictators, scoundrels, and knaves only in ways that contributed to defeating communism in Vietnam, never in any way that might contribute to its victory. Shachtman had decided to back U.S. power in Vietnam as a, quote, shield behind which the democratic revolution could organize itself, end quote. Shachtman first expressed his opposition to U.S. withdrawal in June 1965. In front of 250 people at a forum sponsored by Dissent and the League for Industrial Democracy. Over the next few years, Shachtman seemed to avoid restating his position in public in an attempt not to worsen growing divisions over the war among his socialist followers. But in 1970, Shachtman joined in a statement on Vietnam that reaffirmed his opposition to U.S. withdrawal and took the same basic line of argument as his 1965 speech and elaborated his analysis at length. Both Shachtman's 1965 speech and the 1970 statement on Vietnam reiterated many of the traditional socialist criticisms of U.S. foreign policy that had been part of his position on Korea in 1951 and Cuba in 1961. The 1965 speech repudiated any identification of the South Vietnamese regime as, quote, good, end quote. The 1970 statement opposed any, quote, support for the present Saigon government, end quote. The 1965 speech reaffirmed Shachtman's opposition to U.S. intervention wherever, especially in the Dominican Republic, there was not an immediate danger of a communist military victory. The statement on Vietnam attributed the flawed U.S. Vietnam policy to, quote, the capitalist interest in the Cold War, end quote. It expressed, quote, solidarity with the millions of Americans who yearn for peace, end quote. But in the context of the debate over the war, particularly among socialists, the main thrust of both the speech and the statement was their advocacy of keeping U.S. troops in Vietnam. The driving inner logic of Shachtman's position, both at the 1965 forum and in the 1970 statement, was that a U.S.-backed semi-dictatorship was still better for the democratic left than communism. Shachtman said in 1965 that the Saigon regime, although not, quote, good, end quote, did, quote, permit the possibility of people fighting for their rights, ... In South Vietnam, you can organize a demonstration and get beat on the head, end quote. He said, quote, you can't do that much in North Vietnam, end quote. The 1970 statement said the socialists should prefer the capitalist, quote, countries of peasant countries of political democracy, end quote, to communism, quote, totalitarian despotism, end quote, because a, quote, non-communist South Vietnam, even under the Saigon regime, still leaves intact, if only embryonically, a variety of political and social forces that are independent of both the Saigon government and the totalitarians, Buddhist and other religious groups, political parties and organizations, trade unions, student organizations, end quote. On the basis of this logic, Shachtman, without ever defending the original decision to send U.S. troops, opposed U.S. withdrawal, at least, quote, before the South Vietnamese are in a better position to pursue their own defense, end quote. Shachtman said in 1965 that U.S. withdrawal would be, quote, monstrous, end quote. The 1970 statement argued that withdrawal ending in communist victory would aid Maoism and Guevaraism. Parenthesis, quote, the most irrational, violence-obsessed, and guerrilla-oriented sections and branches of communist totalitarianism, end quote, end parenthesis, as well as, quote, right-wing reaction, end quote, and, quote, neo-isolationist, end quote, forces. During the Vietnam War, Shachtman consistently, and for the first time, argued for a negotiated peace with the communists. The statement on Vietnam demanded free elections in South Vietnam with communist participation, consistent with Shachtman's past opposition to depriving communists of their legal democratic rights. But the statement argued against giving them any place in a South Vietnamese coalition government. It said that such a coalition was, quote, either an illusion for which no precedent can be found anywhere in our time, or a cloak for a more stealthy surrender of the country to the communists, end quote. The statement on Vietnam advanced one other key argument. The South Vietnam was fighting for its, quote, national independence, end quote. The fact that, quote, the government in the South is dominated by a military or semi-military regime, end quote, funded by the United States made no difference, it said. Shachtman never argued that military victory over North Vietnam was possible, but Shachtman said that military defeat would be disastrous. The purpose of waging war should be to win a negotiated settlement, the same trick that the U.S. government ended up trying to pull off. In practice, the idea was full of pitfalls and contradictions. As a result, Shachtman's position on any particular aspect of the war, for example, the U.S. bombing of North Vietnam, was often unclear or changeable. The Socialist Workers Party's newspaper, The Militant, reported that at the 1965 forum, Shachtman said that the bombing would compel North Vietnam to negotiate. Harrington later remembered Shachtman saying in 1966 that, quote, of course the bombing should cease, end quote. Tom Kahn said that Shachtman would simply respond to questions about the bombing by saying, quote, I'm not advising the government on how to carry out this war, end quote. Shachtman did advise the labor and civil rights movement on how to win reforms in the midst of the war. Shachtman insisted that, quote, guns and butter, end quote, were both possible. The Freedom Budget tried to prove his case. A. Philip Randolph's introduction to the budget said that the plan took no position on the war, quote, which is basically a thorny question to be viewed in its own terms, end quote. But the budget foresaw a steadily rising military budget, arguing in effect that the government could fight the Vietnam War and still abolish poverty. It even said, quote, no effort we are making anywhere in the world has any basis except to defend and advance the frontiers of freedom, end quote. When commentary editor Norman Podhoretz questioned whether the country could afford the Vietnam War, Shachtman replied, quote, the country had better be able to afford it, end quote. By 1970, the strategy that the statement on Vietnam put forward for the war dovetailed with the Republican President Richard Nixon was carrying out, quote, Vietnamization, end quote, of the war, ending in a peace agreement providing for elections. The strategy turned out to be at least as ineffective in saving the South Vietnamese regime or the independent South Vietnamese left as U.S. withdrawal would have been. It also took the lives of about 2 million people that U.S. withdrawal in 1965 would have spared, and maimed, poisoned, displaced, and impoverished millions more. The statement on Vietnam's evidence that the U.S. war was fostering democracy in South Vietnam was in fact limited to a virtual handful of genuine Democrats and workers' organizations. The quote, democracy, end quote, that these stalwart non-communists were granted by the U.S.-backed South Vietnamese regime consisted largely of harassment, censorship, imprisonment, and torture. For 30 years, Shachtman had eloquently maintained that only working and oppressed people could effectively defend or extend the democratic freedoms that their past struggles had won under capitalism. Imperialist governments would only undermine and make a mockery of those freedoms. South Vietnam was a compelling example of the validity of that analysis. But by the same time this clinching case came along, Shachtman had changed his mind. The idea that the South Vietnamese were fighting for independence presupposed that South Vietnam was a nation rather than a truncated part of Vietnam set aside at French and U.S. demand in 1954. It ignored the fact that South Vietnam was defending its, quote, independence, end quote, only from other Vietnamese. The communists, however undemocratic, were an independent Vietnamese force that resisted Soviet pressure to accept the division of the country and refused to take sides in the Sino-Soviet conflict in the 1960s. Shachtman saw his defense of South Vietnam as being in continuity with his thinking about national liberation going back to the 1940s, but his last nation that he defended was fictitious. This last nation that he defended was fictitious. Shachtman's stand against U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam positioned Shachtman on the right not only of the Socialist Party but of the Democratic Party as well, during years when massive sections of the U.S. population are moving to the left. It identified Shachtman as an enemy of the new left that emerged from the anti-war movement, cut Shachtman off from the major sections of the labor and civil rights movements, and helped split his own following in the Socialist Party. Shachtman was quite willing to be the new left's enemy. Shachtman saw in the new left all the apologies for Stalinist crimes he remembered from communists in the 1930s. Shachtman used Maoist groups' pronouncements, especially the willingness some of them expressed to dispense completely with democracy and write off the U.S. working class, as an excuse for dismissing the whole generation of revolutionary socialists that grew up in the early 1970s. Because some new leftists saw Ho and Mao as heroes, Shachtman wrote off the whole new left. Quote, as I watch the new left, I simply weep, end quote, he said. Quote, if somebody set out to take the errors and stupidities of the old left and multiply them to the nth degree, you would have the new left of today, end quote. Shachtman saw the new left as vindication for his belief that a left that turned away from the unions would become, quote, crazier and crazier, end quote. He drummed into his remaining followers' heads the need for, quote, permanent vigilance lest the cancer of totalitarianism destroy all that is healthy and promising in the struggle for socialism, end quote. Shachtman had to regret much more deeply his alienation from major forces in the unions and the African American community. Shachtman seemed helpless to prevent labor and civil rights leaders from turning against the war and turning away from his AFL-CIO-led coalition. At best, Shachtman found ways to explain away what he saw as former allies' desertion. Martin Luther King Jr.'s decision to come out publicly against the war in January 1966, though Rustin had enlisted UN Ambassador Arthur Goldberg to try to convince King of Johnson's good intentions, was explained away as the softness of a Gandhian pacifist. Rustin and other moderate civil rights leaders countered King's statement with one of their own in November 1966, saying, quote, for every Negro who tosses a Molotov cocktail, there are 1,000 fighting and dying on the battlefields of Vietnam, end quote. When Walter Reuther came out against the war, contributing to the United Auto Workers' decision to leave the AFL-CIO, Shachtman and his friends dismissed Reuther's break with meaning as the expression of a frustrated ambition to be AFL-CIO president. Shachtman's break with the Socialist Party anti-war left wing, led by pacifist Dave McReynolds, who had originally invited him into the party, caused him relatively little pain. Shachtman's followers were still united at the June 1966 Socialist Convention in rejecting McReynolds' call for unilateral U.S. withdrawal. The Shachtmanites seemed to stand together behind a vague call for a negotiated solution. Disgusted by the Socialist Party's repeated refusal to call plainly for U.S. withdrawal, McReynolds eventually left it in 1970 with a group of followers. The apparent unity of Shachtman's group was a facade. Shachtman's relations with Mike Harrington and Irving Howe were already strained by the end of 1966, with differing attitudes toward the AFL-CIO, new politics, and Vietnam all contributing to the tension. Slowly and organizingly, Harrington, Howe, and many of Shachtman's longtime followers were turning against the war. Shachtman tried to contain the growing tensions over the war by downplaying the issue and minimizing the differences. Shachtman's most deeply held position about Vietnam seemed to be that it should go away. Shachtman, quote, predicted the demise of Vietnam as an issue every year for 6 or 7 years, end quote. End quote. Shachtman tried to avoid debating it in public, to the point where McReynolds said in frustration in February 1967, quote, Shachtman shall be remembered for his wit, for his singularly important contribution to socialist theory, for his principled and early opposition to Stalinism, and, unhappily, for his silence during this time of agony, end quote. But the issue would not go away. In the summer of 1967, Harrington, Howe, and others took a public position in dissent that Shachtman would not support, calling for a halt to the bombing as a prelude to a ceasefire. By the summer and fall of 1968, the war in Vietnam provoked social tremors that shook every corner of the political landscape and threatened to topple governments. Student anti-war protests in Paris led to nationwide general strike in France. Students for a Democratic Society in New York shut down Columbia University. Following his anti-war pronouncements, King was assassinated and inner cities across the United States burned. For Shachtman and his followers, though, what made Vietnam impossible to sidestep was the approach of a presidential election and the fracturing of the Democratic Party. When Senator Eugene McCarthy's strong showing against Lyndon Johnson in the New Hampshire primary prompted Johnson to withdraw from the race in favor of Vice President Hubert Humphrey, Socialists were pulled willy-nilly into a primary campaign that was largely a Democratic referendum on the war. Shachtman could not believe that anyone trained in his school would support McCarthy over Humphrey. Humphrey's record of support for labor was good. His commitment to civil rights went back 20 years. He had led the fight to drive communists out of the Minnesota Democratic Farmer Labor Party. Humphrey would be opposed in November, not only by the old McCarthyist Richard Nixon, but by George Wallace, the new personification of Dixiecrat racism. Realignment in 1968 meant Humphrey. But Humphrey's identification with Johnson's war meant more to Harrington and Howe than Shachtman's strategy. Although they reluctantly backed Humphrey over Nixon and Wallace in the end, Dissent's election eve issue was filled with a debate over whether to vote for Humphrey or abstain. Shachtman called the debate, quote, stupefying, end quote. The people who shared his views showed their feelings by having Humphrey receive the League for Industrial Democracy's 1969 annual award. The award ceremony was bound to provoke a large-scale anti-war protest, and it did. Shachtman and Harrington continued somehow to work with each other in the Socialist Party. Non-aggression agreements were negotiated repeatedly, with each side blaming the other when they broke down. New socialist positions on the war were adopted each year, with Shachtman's allies giving a little ground each time to Harrington's steadily growing reservations. In 1969, the party called for, quote, speedy, end quote, if not immediate withdrawal of U.S. troops, along with, quote, democratization, end quote, of South Vietnam. In a final hard-fought compromise at the Socialist 1970 convention, they declared that if democracy and peace remained unattainable in South Vietnam, U.S. support for the South Vietnamese regime should end. Shachtman and his allies would not let the world think that this stand actually represented them. They issued their public statement on Vietnam in order to make their stand clear. With the statement on Vietnam out in the public, Harrington would no longer refrain from public debate. Harrington attacked the statement signers as advocates of, quote, reactionary anti-communism and, quote, supporters of American foreign policy, even at its worst, end quote. The war was so horrible that a communist victory would be, quote, a genuine lesser evil, end quote, he said now. The attack from Harrington was as unbearable for Shachtman as the attack from Hal Draper had been earlier. Harrington said later that even when he and Shachtman, quote, hardly spoke to one another, ... I never lost my respect and affection for Max, end quote. This, quote, warm, vibrant, utterly serious man who nevertheless sometimes laughed until he cried, end quote. But Shachtman did not allow fond memories to interfere with his bitterness when he felt betrayed. Shachtman described Harrington's charges as, quote, reckless and irresponsible, end quote. Quote, without precedent in what I know of the history of the radical movement, end quote. Shachtman and Harrington did not speak again. The dispute over Vietnam also disrupted Shachtman's relationship with Howe, which had already been destroyed and rebuilt once, although both men tried to save it. Quote, what have we learned over all these bitter years if we can't avoid a split, end quote? Howe asked Shachtman. Shachtman responded with unaccustomed softness. Quote, we have known each other for a good 3 decades, and I respect not only your talents but your continuing commitments, end quote, Shachtman said. Shachtman justified his frankness by saying that he had to say, quote, how I really feel, end quote. Quote, I do not always have the courage to say it to you face to face, end quote. The Socialist Party began to look like two organizations artificially soldered together. And if socialists were conceived as a faction within the Democratic Party, they made up two different factions. Harrington could not make anti-war Democrats bow their heads to a labor-imposed yoke, nor did he want to, especially when they were getting stronger within the Democratic Party. As another election year came around in 1972, Harrington's favored candidate, George McGovern, went primary after primary until he had a solid majority of the party convention. The socialist newspaper New America seemed to be torn in two, printing 2 opposing articles on every major topic. In Shachtman's eyes, New Politics was, quote, a wing of nuts who aim not to hold things together but to bust things apart, end quote. Shachtman saw no reason to support McGovern, he said. Quote, his foreign policy is a monstrosity, not just as bad as Henry Wallace in 1948, but much worse, end quote. McGovern, who advocated withdrawing U.S. troops from Vietnam in 6 weeks, seemed to Shachtman to favor, quote, turning over all of Vietnam to the Stalinists, end quote. Shachtman said that McGovern's campaign ran, quote, entirely against the grain of our realignment policy. He wants an anti-labor machine. I want the opposite, end quote. Quote, I reject, of course, any sympathy or support for Nixon, end quote, Shachtman added. During the primary, Shachtman leaned toward Henry Jackson, a Cold War Democratic senator close to the AFL-CIO who hired Tom Kahn for his staff. When McGovern won the Democratic nomination, Shachtman told Kahn that he admired Meany's, quote, guts, end quote, in declaring neutrality between Nixon and McGovern. The Socialist Party, with Shachtman's allies in the majority, expressed a preference for McGovern, but attacked his supporters for, quote, authoritarian leftist leanings, end quote, elitist and anti-labor tendencies, end quote. Harrington resigned as Socialist Party co-chair in protest. Soon he would leave the organization. The Socialist Party, Shachtman's last hope for building a significant left in the United States, was split. Shachtman was overcome in his last years by nostalgia. Tall outward appearances Shachtman's dedication to his politics never faltered. But the clarity of his mind and firmness of conviction did not protect Shachtman from bouts of ill health, particularly heart trouble. Shachtman complained about the, quote, medical dictatorship, end quote, he sometimes lived under. Besides, many of his old friends and old enemies were dying. People usually have to face this pain in late middle age, those who are lucky enough not to have seen their friends die earlier in wars or epidemics. Shachtman found it hard to bear. The emotional difficulties of getting old were compounded for him by the emotional difficulties of having left behind so much of his past and so many people he had been close to. Intellectually, Shachtman had largely come to terms with the thought that he had spent decades of his political life on a fundamentally mistaken course. He said that he had been wrong in the 1930s and 1940s to cut himself off from the main body of the labor movement as it integrated into the Democratic Party and acquiesced in U.S. foreign policy. But emotionally, Shachtman still could not detach himself from the excitement of old memories, the passion of bygone controversies, and the appeal of Marxist argument and rhetoric. Shachtman's sentimental attachment to his revolutionary past found three different, even contradictory outlets in the late 1960s and early 1970s. As Shachtman defined his own distinct version of social democratic politics, Shachtman continued to insist that what he was elaborating and defending was Marxism. From time to time, Shachtman would still lash out at people who disparaged or strayed from Marxism. Shachtman also kept to the end a soft spot for the Bolshevik tradition, even though his sympathies were now with latter-day Mensheviks. For years, Shachtman immersed himself in documents from the old Communist International without being able to put in writing his own critical rejection of its politics. Shachtman continued finally to look positively on Trotsky and even Trotskyists, if not young Trotskyists around the New Left, then at least the old Trotskyists he had known and worked with. Shachtman even renewed a friendship with Jim Cannon, saying that, quote, the distance disputes placed between us did not diminish the feeling and hopes we shared years ago, unquote. Having a long Marxist heritage to draw on helped to make up for the fact that, in the end, his tight socialist faction was about as small and isolated as his Trotskyist group had been in the 1930s and 1940s. He used to marvel that despite being, quote, correct on almost every single question, end quote, he had so few followers left. There was only one possible explanation, he would joke, quote, we are cursed, end quote. He tried to make up for his isolation from young radicals by reaching out to old social democrats who, like him, remained attached to Marxist terminology. Shachtman pushed for the Socialist Party's reunification with a splinter group of the Socialist Old Guard that had broken away from the party in 1936. The past he had lived through became, for Shachtman, a kind of personal property, and he resented other people's interference in putting forward opinions about it that were different from his own. He dismissed Isaac Deutscher's famous biography of Trotsky as, quote, inexcusably dirty, dishonest, end quote. Shachtman told Theodore Draper, Hal Draper's ex-communist brother and a major historian of the Communist Party, with whom he carried on an otherwise friendly correspondence, quote, you have handicapped yourself by abjuration of Marxism, end quote. He called ignorance of Marxism, quote, as inexcusable, as ignorance of Newton and Darwin, end quote, and dismissed, quote, the belief that Marxism is outlived, end quote, as outlived itself. Perhaps the violence of his attacks on those who saw Marxism differently betrayed a slight insecurity about the Marxism he had ended up with. Shachtman's friendship with Al Glotzer provided one kind of reassurance of continuity with his Marxist past. Since Glotzer had traveled the same political road all the way from the Communist Party, parenthesis, and would continue to uphold Shachtman's version of social democracy after Shachtman died, end parenthesis. Manny Geltman was a dual link to the past in other ways. He was almost the only remaining friend from the old days who had not shared Shachtman's full political evolution, and who was able to tease Shachtman about how far he had come. Geltman also gave Shachtman an excuse to bury himself in records from the communist 1920s and 1930s. An editor with Free Press, parenthesis, owned by Macmillan, end parenthesis, as well as Dissent, Geltman ate lunch with Shachtman once a week during the 1960s. Ostensibly to check on Shachtman's progress on a history of the Communist International, for which Free Press had paid him a $15,000 advance. Shachtman's nostalgia showed in the excitement with which he pursued obscure leads and documents, piling up a mountain of paper by 1972. Shachtman's reluctance to dismiss the whole communist movement as sweepingly as his latter-day politics would have dictated showed in the fact that he never produced so much as a first draft. Glotzer said that Shachtman, quote, saturated, end quote, in Bolshevism, quote, had not reached a focal point where he could do justice to it, end quote. Geltman arranged for him to speak at a conference at Stanford and to spend a month as scholar in residence at another university to no avail. During his scholarship in residence, Shachtman gathered a group of intrigued students around him, fed them with revolutionary history, and, quote, never wrote a line, end quote. At least Shachtman and Geltman's lunches gave them a chance to reminisce and joke. Geltman would recall Shachtman's oath that he would support U.S. imperialism on the day he had long hairs growing on the palm of his hand. Increasingly opposed to Shachtman's support for the Vietnam War, Geltman would take Shachtman's hand across the lunch table and cluck reprovingly at the imaginary hairs growing out of Shachtman's palms. a softness for old Trotskyist memories, suggested a barely acknowledged sense of loss behind Shachtman's rejection of his old politics. Natalia Sadova's death from cancer in 1962 particularly saddened Shachtman.
Tom?
Yeah.
Did you take a little water bottle out of the refrigerator?
Yeah.
Can I have it? I'm taking it with me today to the fair.
Where was I? By becoming Sadova's friend again in the late 1940s, Shachtman had, at least in his own mind, received Trotsky's forgiveness, even the acknowledgement that Trotsky had been wrong in their 1939-40 quarrel, which Trotsky's death had denied him. Natalia Sadova had broken with the Fourth International in 1951, insisting that only people, quote, obsessed by old and outlived formulas, end quote, would uphold Trotsky's view of the Soviet Union as a worker state. Shachtman's visits to Sadova fed his sense of an unbroken tie to Trotsky. Shachtman was with Sadova in 1953 when news came of Stalin's death. Her lack of vindictiveness reminded him of Trotsky's sublime indifference to personal injuries. But Shachtman was almost alone in the value he put on her friendship and opinions. Long before she died, most people had forgotten about her existence. Her death seemed to consign her to oblivion. With hindsight, Shachtman convinced himself that even Trotskyists he had often been at loggerheads with had been wonderful people whom he had always loved. Joe Carter, a Trotskyist since the 1920s and a frequent adversary of Shachtman's in the 1940s, died in 1970. Shachtman had been completely out of touch with Joseph Carter, but he could not reconcile himself to the man's having, quote, gone silently, unnoticed, unmourned, ungoddamned, for with only a vague memory left behind, end quote. Most remarkably, Shachtman's old affection for Jim Cannon returned. Cannon had gradually become a semi-retired elder statesman of the Socialist Workers Party after moving to Los Angeles in 1954. Shachtman he had occasional pleasant phone conversations in the 1960s. When Cannon's wife and Shachtman's old friend Rose Carsoner died in 1968, Shachtman wrote, quote, I only wish now that I could put my arms around Jim on this cruel day, end quote. In 1972, Shachtman actually visited Cannon in California. Cannon was old and frail and seemed to know that he had only a few years to live. Somehow the two men managed to transcend their differences, which had grown steadily wider, and enjoy each other's company. Shachtman returned from the trip and told Geltman that the reunion had been marvelous. Shachtman's forgiveness of old enemies did not soften his bitterness toward current enemies. On the contrary, Shachtman was angry at the foolish people who had survived while so many better, wiser people had died. He felt himself to be surrounded by detractors who lacked elementary honesty and decency. Tom Kahn saw him cry more than once when people broke with him. Beneath the anger, there was an anguish that Shachtman shrank from. One of his followers from the 1940s and 1950s, Stan Weir, ran into him at a United Auto Workers convention in 1968, where Shachtman was attacking Walter Reuther for opposing the Vietnam War. The two began arguing in the hallway. Soon, Weir was explaining that he owed his understanding of why the war was wrong to Shachtman, along with many other things he owed to Shachtman. Shachtman almost ran away. Quote, he said, quote, you're killing me, end quote, end quote. Weir remembered, quote, and I was because, ... we're both going to stand there and weep, end quote. The loss of many of the human landmarks of Shachtman's past, through either their deaths or his anger at their deserting his politics, made him cling all the more to those left who remained loyal. Tom Kahn remembered that, quote, bear-hug warmth, end quote, of Shachtman's friendship in those last years. Quote, Max was always there for advice, for uplift, and for commiseration, end quote, Kahn said. Quote, his telephone rang constantly, end quote. He enjoyed doing his friends favors, tinkering with their stereo systems. Set in his convictions, still doing his best to hold together the people and groups he could, Shachtman nonetheless spent much of his time at home in Floral Park, pleased when his loyalists visited him there. On the 3rd of November 1972, Kahn came by and the two talked, as usual, about their allies' and enemies' hopes and setbacks. The next day, 4th of November, Shachtman died of heart failure. The end. Thank you so much for listening.